Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our study of the life of Christ here in the main auditorium class. We're looking at week 12, and David Washburn had the extra copies of week 12. If you're visiting with us and still need a copy, raise your hand, and we'll be sure and get that to you. And then he's handing out the lesson for next week, week 13, which will bring us to the end of this quarter, the end of the semester, but not the end of the life of Christ. We will spend January through March looking at the other half of our study of the life of Christ. And today we're kind of finishing up the Galilean ministry, and there is a special training of the 12 around Galilee. And so we're talking about that today and next week. But we're glad that you're here. We have a number who are visiting with us. Thank you for being here. And I'm going to lead us in prayer, and following that prayer, we can begin our study together. So let's all pray. Our gracious Father in heaven, we come to Thee because we know that You are the creator of all things, the creator of us ourselves and this new day You've created. We come to Thee to thank You for it and to pray that You would help us take advantage of this day to open our eyes to how we've been created in Thy image, the special privilege that we've been given among all of Thy creation, to draw near to Thee, to please Thee. And we're thankful for the example that Thy Son has left us. We're thankful that He left heaven to take on this human experience, take on flesh and blood, so that we could see Thee and know more about who You are. And we pray that You'd help us to become like Him so that we could thus be fitted for an eternity in heaven. Be with us in this Bible study then is our prayer, and with all of the Bible classes and with all of Thy people who throughout the world assemble on this first day of the week to remember the death of our Savior for us. We ask all of this in His name, in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, so we are looking at the training of the 12, and there'll be a later Judean ministry. Perea was right across the Jordan River from Judea, a brief ministry there, and then the great bulk of next semester's study will be the final week, really, of Jesus' life leading up to the cross, and that's what the evangelists focus on. That's what Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John focus on. A lot of the things that we wish they had spent more time on when he was a young teenager, we don't learn anything about that. But they do talk about, his arrest, trial, crucifixion, burial, resurrection, and those things were the most important for the evangelists to record for us, for the Holy Spirit to leave with us. And since our salvation hinges upon that, I think you can understand why that is. But again, today, this training of the 12, we'll be looking at some of these events where Jesus, for example, goes outside of Jewish territory briefly, Tyre and Sidon. He's going to heal a Gentile woman's daughter there, and the lessons about what this Gentile could teach some of the Jews is very important. A deaf man who is healed in the region of Decapolis, from the Greek polis, a city, and then Deca, 10 principal cities made up this, again, Gentile territory on the east side of the Sea of Galilee. There'll be the feeding of the 4,000. We've already observed the feeding of the 5,000. And leading up to Jesus' transfiguration and Elijah coming in the person of John the Baptist are some of the events that we're looking at this morning. A Gentile mother's faith, all the way down to John the Baptist being the Elijah that was spoken of. So again, maybe by way of geography, you can see the green area here, Galilee. Actually, this is Jewish territory, all the green, and the yellow would be Gentile territory. And so this woman, Syrophoenician woman, Jesus is going to leave the area of the Sea of Galilee where he's been, travel up through Tyre and Sidon. And then after that, he's going to travel north up to Caesarea Philippi, where Peter, for example, is going to say that make that confession that he is in fact the Christ, the Son of God, it's probably up here at Mount Hermon where Jesus is going to be transfigured. And so some of these are the areas that we're looking at this morning as far as where things are happening. So let's start with this Gentile mother's faith. Matthew records it, Matthew 15, beginning of verse 21. Mark also records it in Mark chapter 7. Here's what Matthew says in Matthew 15, verse 21. Jesus went away from there and withdrew into the district of Tyre and Sidon. And a Canaanite woman from that region came out and began to cry out, saying, "Have mercy on me, Lord, Son of David. My daughter is cruelly demon-possessed." Matthew uses the term Canaanite. Matthew, writing to the Jews, would use a term that would ring with them because Canaanite was an Old Testament term. It referred to all of those peoples who occupied the land that God promised to his people, descendants of Abraham, but they had to conquer it first. So it's just Matthew's way of saying, pagan Gentile and connecting her with the pagans of the past. Mark refers to her as a Syro-Phoenician woman, Syria and Phoenicia. So Mark is a little more accurate as far as where she lived and maybe her descent. But regardless, the point is, whether Matthew or Mark, both of them are making the strong point that this is a non-Jewish woman. This is not someone you would expect to know anything about God or have any good qualities in her because she's not of the people of God. But one of the things the gospel writers have done well is to remind us that those who are privileged are not always the ones who demonstrate the greatest appreciation or response to that privilege. And here's a woman who you would not have expected to have much faith, and yet she's going to. Assignment number 1 says, which of the following can you establish from the text as elements of her great faith? Well, let me continue reading here. Verse 23, the situation has been presented. She has a demon-possessed daughter and wants Jesus to help. To our surprise, verse 23 says, but he did not answer her a word. But the surprises do not end here. And his disciples came and implored him, saying, send her away. It's not just that Jesus is ignoring her. The disciples are saying, send her away because she keeps shouting at us. Have you ever been embarrassed because you're close to somebody and they're making a commotion or whatever, and you don't want any of that? Send her away. Verse 24. But he answered and said, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And so Jesus is still not wanting to help. But, verse 25, she came and began to bow down before him. Now here's the thing. Jesus has already ignored her. The disciples are saying, send her away. Jesus is giving some reasons why it looks like he won't help. And so she just dropped her, well, that's the way it's going to be. I'm out of here. Where's my lawyer? I'm gone. No, that's us today, right? We get all offended, all blown. No, she comes back. Or she comes and begins to bow down before him saying, Lord, help me. Well, now Jesus is going to help, right? Because she's been so persistent. Verse 26, he answered and said, it is not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. We're done with that. Use that term dogs and prejudice and this and that. We're just out of here. This is not right. Verse 27, but she said, yes, Lord, but even the dogs feed on the crumbs which fall from their master's table. And so she picks up on his illustration, puts herself in it and says, I'd be glad just to have the crumbs because the crumbs from you is more than enough for what I need. Verse 28, Jesus said to her, O woman, your faith is great. It shall be done for you as you wish. And her daughter was healed at once. So which of these qualities in that list there, number 1, do you see in this woman? Sister Penny, thank you. D. Letter D, yeah, that's a good choice because it covers letter A, persistence, right? We've pointed that out. Humility. Yeah, I'm not of the people of God. Nope. But letter C, confidence in Jesus' power, no matter how small its measure, even crumbs from you, Lord, just a crumb of your power is enough. Somebody says, yeah, but that still doesn't answer the question about Jesus' prejudice here. I mean, that's just not right. Anybody want to respond to that before I maybe comment? Penny, do you want to?
Well, God isn't indebted to us, but he always responds to humble, obedient faith.
God is not indebted to us, but he always responds to humble, obedient faith. That's true. And that first one is what's hard for us. In this age in which we've got our rights and we do this and that, and we, human beings, man, are so important, we think we can make God in our own image. And maybe God needs to act the way I think he should act. Seems like I heard that comment not too long ago, indirectly anyway. I just don't like the way God has responded in the past. I don't like some of his decisions. If that were the case, I mean, before your creator, what are you going to do about that? I mean, in what position are you to say that? Now, really, what needs to be dealt with is it possible that I'm not understanding, my creator and some of his decisions, but if you and I are the creatures, then what can we do about that? Did I see another hand somewhere? Over here, okay. Go ahead, Bill. Mm-hmm.
First of all, it's amazing for me that dealing with teenage kids to know who's demon possessed and who's not demon possessed. So,
okay. Was that a little?
That I've read so many times where his disciples are telling him what to do. We're trying to tell him what to do. Mm-hmm. Like, send them away so we can eat. Let them go eat. Send them away. Send her away. Stop doing this. Or, no, I'm not going to do that. We're the created. We don't tell the creator, no, I'm not going to go somewhere.
That's a good point. This is not the only time the disciples have tried to, order Jesus around, as it were. Not only send this woman away, are they saying, but send the crowds away or whatever. And Jesus doesn't do that. And because he doesn't do that, good things happen. So here's the real problem. We don't like the way God acts, and yet the way God acts is always good for everybody. Here in this situation, the fact that Jesus would not answer her a word, or that he would say something about how that he was sent only to the house of Israel. The truth of the matter, that was just a statement of fact. He would later send the 12 apostles into all the world, to everybody, including these people. Can God not send someone to some group first and then to others somewhere else later, and that not be prejudice, or partiality, practicing partiality? And really, I think the issue here is that we read this and we view Jesus as maybe ourselves, somebody who's just kind of reacting to this woman. Is it possible that Jesus was refusing to speak to her or saying these things in order to bring out or allow her to demonstrate this persistence and this humility that we are talking about here? When you think about it, persistence cannot even exist, can it? If there's no opposition, if there's no pushback, if there's no obstacle. Can there be such a thing as persistence if you're in a stream, a river that's just kind of carrying you down there? So there has to be some kind of pushback, obstacle, whatever, for this individual to either overcome it and show persistence or not. Is it not possible that Jesus does what he does in order to demonstrate to the disciples here just how persistent she was? And by not answering her a word initially, and by speaking the fact that it's not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. The dogs here, by the way, is a reference to those, pets, around the house, whatever, which are loved by the family. That's it. He's not It's not deprecative. No, what am I trying to say? I can only think of it in Spanish. No está despreciando la raza. He's not putting down the Syrophoenician people. The point is that that's a true statement, and it allowed her to say the things that she says about how that's true, we're not part of God's people, but even a little crumb of your power would be enough to solve my problems and demonstrate her faith. Jesus, I believe, is doing and saying everything that he does here in order to allow this woman to show just how persistent, humble as she is. If he doesn't do that, none of that comes out. And that's kind of hard. Jesus knew what was in the mind of man. He's not just a man. And so he has that ability to do that. We can't, and so we can't imagine him maybe doing that. But there is no indication here of partiality or racism or that kind of thing in Jesus here. Sister.
You just said what I was going to say, that God, Jesus being deity, knows the thoughts and intents of our heart. And that would support what you're saying.
And if you will, when you read through the gospel accounts, think about that a little more often. Open your mind to the fact that Jesus is not doing or saying this because he needs the information or he's just reacting or whatever. Maybe he's doing this because he's trying to give the other person an opportunity to somehow demonstrate something. Karen and then Dave. Mm-hmm.
I was just thinking about how we as people, we have these debates, conversations with people, and but when it comes to Jesus and God, when they're doing something, and we have to be so careful how we question their motives and why they're doing it. It reminds me of how God's answered Job. Mm-hmm. And even though he might have questions, God reminded Job who Job was compared to who he was.
Correct.
And I think we need to keep that level of respect and awe of who the Creator is in order to come to him if we have questions in a very humble manner, but to not challenge him.
We don't have to understand what God is doing. We just have to respect that he knows what he's doing because he's creator. Dave?
Well, I was just going to say that Jesus using this event to be a great lesson for them and for us because it was recorded and we're still talking about it.
Everybody who's read the scripture since then, for them and for us. I mean, we're benefiting from this because God did things the way we didn't think he should have handled it, because he handled it the way we thought he was mishandling, and yet here we are reaping the benefits of it. In fact, I want to bring us back to this final point. Jesus does not do what the disciples suggest in sending her away. He ultimately heals the woman's son. She gets her request. How can you be miffed about what Jesus does here? That fact alone should remind us that there must have been something in his refusal to answer and this kind of thing. There must be something bigger going on. Not only is he demonstrating for the disciples and for us this woman's faith, she herself needed to realize that this persistence she had and her faith was what was granting her this salvation of her daughter. She needed to know that in God's eyes, that's what's important. And so for that to happen, there's going to have to be some obstacles, some pushback for her to be able to be persistent. And then once that's done, she said, now here's exactly what has saved you. And now she knows what it is that God appreciates and what she needs for anything regarding her own salvation from sin and spiritual things and that kind of deal.
I'm not sure I can really pull it all together, but it reminded me of the story of Naaman and Elisha and how he had the leprosy, and the little slave girl, a child, knew about Jehovah God through that prophet. And when somehow it came about that if he had asked you to do something grandiose, because he asked you just to go down and dip in the water, and I mean he was expecting to do something really big and grand, and that wasn't what he expected, so he was not going to do it until the little child.
Well, the little slave girl is a Jew, so she knows about the true God, and she's the one that gets things started. It's Naaman's servants who then come to him and say, look, if the prophet had asked you to do some big thing, how much easier something small? So there's a number of people to come together here and help all that out. But persistence, humility, confidence in Jesus' power is what we need today, obviously. All right, so somewhere around Galilee, Jesus is going to feed 5,000, and that's 4,000. That's assignment number 2 here. If you thought that somehow Jesus, is partial, or there's some racism going on or whatever, why does Jesus feel compassion on the large crowd of about 4,000 that he fed miraculously? You're not reading the gospel accounts. There's too much here of Jesus being moved by compassion to be able to charge him with those other things. But why? Why is it that he's feeling compassion for them here, Sister Ethel?
They were pain on the way home.
Yeah. They had been with him already 3 days without food, or maybe having run out of food if they brought some initially. And what would have happened to them if Jesus had not fed them? They would have fainted on the way, Jesus says, Mark 8 and verse 3. So it's not like Jesus doesn't take into account the material side of us. He does. It's just he's reminding us that there is a greater eternal spiritual side that needs to have importance. But he takes care of the material, the physical as well. But here, they have already been with him for 3 days. Very different crowd than, say, John chapter 6, the 5,000 who were fed. They're fed miraculously also, but then they're back the very next day because they're wanting more food. They're with Jesus because of the material that they can get out of him. These are there with him 3 days before he ever does any kind of a miracle involving food. And that's the point. And what lesson does that provide? It appears that this crowd of people place more importance on blank than on their blank. Now, those are big blanks, and there's numbers of ways you could answer that. So do not be shy. Don't be afraid. We're going to pull everybody's answers together here. Volunteer to start off, David?
I filled it in with spiritual food rather than or physical food rather than their spiritual food.
In that order?
Well,
I think they put more importance on the spiritual food, right, than on the physical. The 3 days there with Jesus before the food. Okay, how did somebody else put that? Because there is no one right or wrong. Right here.
Another illustration of how those who are not God's people sometimes demonstrate greater faith, like the centurion and the Syrophoenician woman. It's not like a birthright. It's something they have to work for.
Right, and that I kind of skipped that point. The Syrophoenician woman obviously demonstrated a great faith in someone who was outside of God's people, and there were a number like that Jesus pointed out. And precisely because there was no pride. Her need was greater than any pride that there might have been. And that's what's going to be our salvation. She's not the one crying, racist, 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 what are you doing, dogs? And this. It's us, But she was the one that had the little daughter that was demon possessed, and not us. And she had the need, recognized that God could take care of it. When she humbles herself and demonstrates her faith, God answers. And she finds out that God is not a racist, by the way. But that's just us, 21st century America. We're the only ones with that problem. But anyway, she was a Gentile. And so Jesus is, making that point with his own people. But coming back here, following Jesus is more important than their stomachs, or hearing his teaching is more important than their appetites or their hunger or whatever. There's a number of ways you might have put that. But these 3 days before Jesus provides any food is very, very telling. So Dalmanutha, also referred to as Magdala or Magadan in several of the gospel accounts, It's probably all the same place here on the west side of the Sea of Galilee. This region of Decapolis, you can see, it extended more than what's here on the map, but Gadara, the Gadarenes, probably on the basis of this city, and there's some other important cities. There's going to be a deaf and mute man in this area of Decapolis. Over here at Magdala or Dalmanutha, the scribes and Pharisees are going to be asking a sign from Jesus. That's where some of these things are happening. So assignment number 3, why do you suppose the deaf man also spoke with difficulty? Is Mark the only one that gives us account? Mark chapter 7. I want to say that's correct. Going into chapter 8 as opposed to Matthew. Again, if you never got one of those tables with all of the events on them, you definitely want to get that, because my individual lesson sheet here doesn't have the events or those Bible passages on it. I try to put them up here on our chart, but you definitely need that, and it's free. We don't charge anything for that table. It's available right now on the website. I could have pulled it down yesterday if you wanted to. But do get that chart. Mark chapter 7, at the end of 7, going into 8, he mentions the feeding of the 4,000 in the first 10 verses of chapter 8. And then verses 11 and following, the Pharisees. Actually, it's the end of 7, right? The end of 7 where he mentions that. A deaf and mute man. Beginning verse 31, again he went out from the region of Tyre and came through Sidon to the Sea of Galilee. So up there at Tyre and Sidon is where that Syrophoenician woman was. Now he's back to the area of the Sea of Galilee within the region of Decapolis. They brought to him one who was deaf and spoke with difficulty, and they implored him to lay his hand on him. So the first part of the question was, why do you suppose this deaf man spoke with difficulty also? Karen?
If you can't hear, you don't really know how things are supposed to be pronounced.
Okay.
So it probably does the best you can, but it sounds different.
Speaking comes from hearing. We don't think about that. I mean, we just grow up and we don't, analyze the process, but we speak English or Spanish or whatever because that's what's around us and that's what we're hearing. And we say words on the basis of how we're hearing them pronounced. That's why sometimes, we have a southern drawl, whatever it is. I can't even do one, but it's depending on where you grow up, everybody around you, if they're doing that southern drawl, that's what you're gonna sound like. But if you haven't heard, you might read lips and try to, or if your hearing is impaired in some way, then your speaking is also going to be along those lines. Why do you suppose that Jesus took him aside from the crowd by himself to heal him? Sister Ruth?
I think he wanted a more personal relationship with him.
He wanted a more personal relationship. I think that's exactly right. The first thing is to remove all distraction so that he can, in fact, focus on Jesus and know that this is the one who's saving me. It's not, all of the herbs that I've, been trying here recently, and maybe, all of my friends and relatives have been saying, if you take this stuff, you'll get well. It finally all came together. No, it's this guy. Focus on Jesus, what Jesus would do, which then brings us to number 4. If we keep reading here in verse 33, Jesus took him aside from the crowd by himself and put his fingers into his ears. Well, that's not too bad, Have you ever had anybody put their fingers into your ears? But after spitting, he touched his tongue with the saliva. Now, has anybody stuck their fingers on your tongue? And looking up to heaven with a deep sigh, he said to him, Ephatha, Ephatha, that is, be opened. Even in English, Ephatha is, like in the original language, something that you can see the mouth moving. You can read the lips easier with that word. What is this, about Jesus making or spitting, and with the saliva putting it on his tongue. Would you normally allow someone to put their own spit on your tongue? With their fingers, Mark 7:33. Post-COVID. Pre-COVID, who would? Either way, probably most of us say no, right? Would you allow it if you thought it would give you back your ability to hear and speak? Well, I mean, that's a big... Saliva in somebody's finger is pretty gross, but being able to speak is pretty nice. It's hard even for us to answer this question. Why? For the majority of us. We've never had the hearing, the deaf mute problem. And so how can you, but talk to somebody who's been aching to say some things, to mom and dad, love you, or a boyfriend or girlfriend or something, and that's a different story. But yeah, we would do it if we knew that this, because, it doesn't cost too much to let somebody touch your tongue when you think about it. It's a lot easier to do that sometimes to get insurance through Kaiser Permanente. Did I tell you all I got refused the first time I applied to Kaiser? I was underweight. And so I went, and they made me get a physical. Got a physical, checked out, no problems. Sorry, you're underweight. Okay, fine, so I went with Pacific Care, whatever. A few years later, the brethren were saying, you really need to get with Kaiser. I tried that. No, I got it. So I applied again and got in. And, now the doctor says, oh, I like your weight, but regardless, it can be a hassle. It wouldn't be any problem at all if somebody just touch your tongue, a lot cheaper. What quality in the man of Mark 7:33 is demonstrated by all this? Donna?
I was not sure that you could make a definitive answer on that because, just like you said, he might have thought, well, it's worth a try, or he might have had great faith. Jesus knew the answer to that.
He certainly didn't walk away saying, ew, no. He didn't do that. He stayed with him. And there would seem to be some faith there, however small. I mean, if you let's give it a try, it would be very small faith, right? But Jesus is willing to take that and point out it's faith, Now, our faith may not be as big. How about the father of the child that the disciples could not cast the demon out? And at least the man said, I believe, help thou my unbelief. And because it is faith that is critical, as we know. And however much he believed, if you want to take out that word or whatever, make it a small faith, it's fine. He allows Jesus to do something so unusual or repulsive or whatever because he thinks that a greater outcome can be there. Comments or questions you might have on any of that? Thank you, Tammy.
He was mute, not just because he couldn't hear, because 35 says that his tongue was, he had an impediment, and that he was loosed. So,
Again, which verse, I'm sorry?
35.
35, and his ears were opened, and the impediment of his tongue was removed, and he began to speak plainly. We're going to make a point out of that maybe in the next verse, but...
Yeah, so my little side note says it was a bond or he was loosed.
Bond
so
was loosed.
I wonder if he was like tongue-tied, because sometimes there's a piece of skin underneath your tongue that's attached, and if it's not fixed, you can't move your tongue in order to speak. So.
That's possible. The term bond here is hard to know if it's used literally, in which case this physical or this medical condition that you're talking about, or figuratively, he can't speak because he's never been able to hear well, to imitate the sounds or whatever. Regardless, he not only does the Bible say his ears were open, the impediment of his tongue was removed, he began speaking plainly. If Jesus had not worked a miracle on him, it would have taken this guy still months and years to start hearing and imitating the sounds if this was going to be a natural thing. So we're not denying the miracle at all, regardless of whether that impediment was a part of the medical condition or whether it was just due to him not ever having heard these sounds. We can say this, or at least observe this detail. The man's blank were first open, and then he was able to blank plainly. What did you put in those blanks? Okay, his ears were first open. Then he was able to speak. And in the same way, we will have something worthwhile to say only after first opening our hearing, our ears to the Word of God. Questions or comments you might have on any of that? Okay, so we've got to keep moving along here. Again, here's where on the western side of the Sea of Galilee, the Pharisees are going to be asking for a sign. And the only sign that's going to be given them is that of Jonah. They're testing Jesus. They're not asking for a sign in order that they might believe. They're not interested in genuine evidence. They're testing him, the evangelists tell us. What signs were they able to read or discern? Sister Ruth?
Signs of the weather.
Yeah, weather signs. Can you find somebody today that's not able to talk about the weather? At least if they're, 50 or older, right? Everybody finds it easy to talk about the weather. And they were too. But they weren't able to read what kind of signs? Sister Ruth, what did you have for the rest of that?
They weren't able to,
What signs did they seem unable or unwilling to read or discern?
his signs.
Yeah, Jesus' signs, his miracles that were pointing to the fact that he is divine, he's deity. All of the miracles that he'd been doing, the healing. Again, this is, if we're in Matthew's account, the previous healing that was mentioned, the feeding of the 4,000. Jesus had already been doing many signs. They want a personal sign for entertainment or who knows what, but they weren't able to discern in these miracles, Jesus, Son of God, has come, the Messiah is here, the kingdom is upon us, those kinds of things they weren't able to see. So again, from there, they're going to take a boat ride and end up at Bethsaida. I don't know if it's on the ride over there or after they arrive that Jesus warns the disciples, here number 7, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Now they've just had an encounter with these fellows again, and Jesus is saying, beware of the leaven. The disciples hear leaven and they think bread, right? Literal bread. Oh, we forgot to bring bread and he's on to us now because, and it wasn't that at all. And so what defect or deficiency did these words from Jesus reveal in his disciples? Pat?
The leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees was their influence to spread evil and rejection of Jesus.
Okay.
Their false teaching.
So again, the wicked influence of these, the Pharisees would be, for example, their influence would be hypocrisy. Isn't that Luke's statement? Self-righteousness. Luke 16 and verse 15, like the older brother. And then Luke 16:15, the next chapter, I'm sorry. They justified themselves, Jesus said. Social and religious prejudice. Prostitutes and tax collectors, they were very much inferior religiously. And folks that weren't Jews, were inferior. So there's a lot of prejudice going on. The Sadducees, they were the liberals of the day. They didn't believe in the spiritual realm, the resurrection, angels, and that kind of a thing. And so here's maybe the Pharisees, very ultra-conservative, and the Sadducees, the liberals of their day. Both had bad influence, or could have bad influence on the disciples. Herod was kind of a compromise between Judaism and the modern Greco-Roman culture, this moral cowardice. We've already seen how because of the peers and men who were around him, that promise he made to Herodias' daughter, he was going to carry through on. So there's a number of bad attitudes and actions that were in the Pharisees and the Sadducees and Herod that could act as leaven on the disciples, and they weren't comprehending that Jesus was talking about the spiritual realm. They said, oh, we forgot to bring bread. But we've already seen them weak spiritually. Number 8, Jesus' miracles. And number 8 has a connection here. Jesus' miracles, like the one in Mark 8:22-26, where he heals this blind man, but at stage number 1, the blind man, sees men walking around like trees. And it looks like Jesus is not really having a good day, or something. He kind of halfway healed the guy. What's going on here? But Jesus' miracles were paralleling some spiritual conditions in his own disciples. And the disciples who were not able to see very clearly, Jesus is having to work with them and bring them along in stages, and he heals this guy in stages to provide a material, a parallel. It's just like what I've done with this man here. But I don't stop until things are perfect. And my disciples, they're not seeing clearly yet. They're doing better than they did yesterday, but I'm not going to stop with them until they can see clearly. The fact that they can't see clearly still is seen in the very next event where Peter is going to rebuke Jesus because he doesn't understand that the Christ must also suffer. But hopefully that parallel between the blind man who saw men walking around like trees and the disciples will kind of help you understand why Jesus might have healed that guy in that way. They go up to Caesarea Philippi, and that's where Peter's going to make this statement about Jesus being the Christ. This is number 9. Did he understand all that it meant for Jesus to be the Christ when he said that? Probably not, because he later is going to, when Jesus gives the correct picture of the Christ, that I've got to go up to Jerusalem and suffer and be mistreated, Peter disagrees, rebukes the Lord and says, no, we're not going to let that happen. So he must have been looking for a glorious Christ, one coming on a white horse, who's going to be a military leader to conquer the Romans. But Jesus says the Christ must suffer, be rejected, be killed. And his followers are going to have to go through that same thing. If we don't see the Christ properly, our following of him is not going to be good and right. And so Jesus is foretelling, his death and resurrection with all of this. And he's talking about public commitment that his disciples have to make. They've got to be willing to carry their own cross and be persecuted and all. And then from there up to Mount Hermon, where we don't know exactly the mountain. It's not specified, but if they're up in this area of Caesarea Philippi, Mount Hermon is one of the possible candidates because it is a high mountain. The text says a very high mountain. And even to this day, there can be snow up on Mount Hermon, as these pictures point out. Number 10, Peter spoke about making 3 tabernacles, one for Jesus, one for Moses, one for Elijah, not realizing what he was saying. What did he not realize when he made that statement? He's putting Jesus on the same level as? Yeah, on the same level with other men, however great they might have been. And they were great men, but they were just that, men. And so that was the problem. Number 11, the point about Jesus' sole authority is made both by what the Father in heaven says. That voice comes out of heaven saying, you listen to Jesus. And the other way the way the point is made is that they look up and Jesus was alone. Moses and Elijah had disappeared. So men will come and go. Jesus, who was there before Moses and Elijah appeared, is there after they're gone. Jesus is the sole authority. He's the one that abides. And then number 12, what was he speaking with Moses and Elijah about? Well, his coming death. His departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem, is how Luke states it. Luke 9:31 is what you want there. He wasn't able to speak about that with his disciples. They didn't understand. Every time he talked about having to die, they couldn't understand that. So maybe it was good that he had the conversation with Moses and Elijah, because only those seemed to understand. Transfigured while he was praying, and the Christian will be transformed in part by prayer. And then number 14, the coming of the Old Testament prophet Elijah was realized in John the Baptist. We're out of time. If you need any of these answers, have any questions about into the lesson here, feel free to talk with me about that anytime. Thanks for being in the class. We're going to take about a 10-minute break before we begin our worship service.